All right. Well, thank you for being with us this afternoon for our contractors conversation. Can I just edit that out? Anyway, so we're here with Doug Howard from Remodelers Advantage, AKA The Fixer, and he has a wonderful presentation, and I'm going to let him tell you all about it.
All right. Well, thank you, Angela. It's great to be here. A huge fan of Pro Mid-Atlantic and all of what goes on in this organization. I've met many of you through that process, and there's so much power in coming together with ideas and sharing them, and that's really the world that I get to live in every day. So thanks so much for taking some time out of your day. We're going to talk about what I think is one of the biggest topics right now that we're seeing with so many remodeling companies and really companies of all kinds right now, which is throughput, how to get things through the process and the impact that that's going to have on what the rest of 2022 looks like and how well set up we are for 2023. So we're going to talk about 6 strategies, and I'll kind of walk you through those. We're going to do it in a little bit of a lighthearted fashion, have a little bit of fun, because I think you'll probably remember more of it. But yeah, absolutely, ask questions, stop, and we'll kind of go from there. So Angela, I'm going to share my screen if that will work, hopefully. You guys see that?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Well, that's 50% of the battle right there for me. So we're going to talk today about throughput. This is a presentation that we've given different kinds of presentations around this topic, but this is one we've created specifically for Pro Mid-Atlantic. It's the first time we're taking it out and showing it. So anxious to see your feedback and your thoughts. So as Angela said, my name is Doug Howard. I'm the Director of Consulting for Remodelers Advantage. Remodelers Advantage is celebrating its 30th year this year as a company that provides peer groups for remodeling companies all over the United States. In November, I'll be celebrating my 5 years with the company, which seems largely impossible. I use this picture, I cut and pasted this from another presentation, and when I didn't do a great job. It was kind of out of proportion. And then I realized that was the thinnest picture anybody's seen of me in a long, long time. So I leave it there now.
I like it, Doug. I like it.
I just leave that sitting there for some period of time. Roundtables is the program that Remodelers Advantage has. Those are our peer groups programs. I mention that because I want you to know that what we're going to talk about over the next hour or so are things that come from actual remodeling clients and remodeling members all over the country that are putting these tactics to work. So this isn't philosophy. This isn't our best idea or best guess. As my boss, Victoria Downing, likes to say, we believe R&D stands for rip off and duplicate, which means we like to see what the best folks are doing and share that with the people that are in the industry so we can raise the whole level of what's going on. So, obviously today there are some extraordinary challenges. We've kind of gone from one extreme to the other. I remember talking to folks in March of 2020 saying, Doug, we're never going to be working inside again. I better learn how to focus on decks and siding and things I can do from outside the building. And then we had this total turnaround in the industry where people, I think, because of spending a lot of time in their homes and wanting more space and really giving some thought to, what it meant to spend more of their even vacation time at home, all of a sudden we saw this tremendous surge in the industry, something we could never have predicted. And then immediately we were met with some of the biggest challenges to go along with that surge, which are things like some of the things listed here that many of the folks that we work with day in and day out, I'm sure you as well, are experiencing. So right now, for many, many companies, sales are far outselling production capacity. For some, that's starting to level off a little bit, but we still have folks that are saying, hey, I usually do $3 million a year. I've sold 5, and I'm not even sure I can get 2.5 out the door. So that's really where a big part of this throughput conversation comes from. Availability of qualified staff to hire, right? Who's out there in the marketplace? How do we attract them? How do we get them hired? We have this demand for work, and we're trying to get folks, on board and keep the folks that we have and not burn out the ones that are there. So we have the added pressure of demands and pressure on our existing staff. Project delays due to COVID, project delays due to material flow, rising project costs during design. The challenge of when I first met the customer, they were in this ballpark. Then by the time we actually got them to design, it was this number. As we get closer to production, the number maybe is significantly different. How do we keep them in the ballpark? And all the while looking at, especially for the companies out there that are design build by nature, how do we keep folks in the fold where normally, once we had them in design, the vast majority made it all the way through to construction. And now we see some hiccups along the way. And we have to be better at predicting all of that. In all of that, there's the increased cost and the increased challenges of just managing projects, waiting for those last components to come in, jobs that are stretching out while we're waiting for things to happen, and disruptions along the way. So we have this huge set of challenges. Now, in that, it would be very easy for a lot of folks to take the position, to take the understanding that, there's just so many things that are out of our control. How do you even plan? Why do you even have a schedule? Can you even maintain that? Or is it just, we got to just do the best we can? And one of the things that we're seeing, the companies that are really starting to excel during this period of time, that have navigated this fairly well, they've basically taken the premise that says, if there are many more things that are out of our control, we're going to be twice as good, twice as diligent at the things we can control, right? We're going to really focus on the things that most matter. And so really some of the strategies that I'm going to talk to you about here in just a few minutes are born out of how can we do the things that we know we need to do in a way that makes it more likely that even if we have outside forces that are slowing us down or tripping us up, that we're still going to be able to deliver quality projects, on time, in a budget, and that kind of thing. And in all of this, these are the challenges right this minute. We also know that at any given moment, economic shifts, things going on in the industry, and a lot of things that are happening, not nationally, but regionally. We're hearing a lot of folks that are predicting sort of what happens next, say that really you can look at the national trends, but you really need to be focused on what's happening in your region, because not everybody had the same surge in activity. Not everybody's having the same limitations in terms of product and staffing. And because of that, what happens next may be more regionally driven than nationally driven. But as we're adjusting to all those things, it needs to really impact the way we estimate projects, right? Some things that we know shouldn't take that long, but they just are taking that long. Well, we've got to build that into our models now. If something used to take 6 weeks and it takes 8 weeks, we better be building 8 weeks into that estimate, because the fact that it's out of the norm is starting to be, the new norm. It's starting to be that case. We also need to be able to manage customer expectations. That roller coaster that a customer goes through on a remodeling project has always been a huge challenge, right? But now we know there are additional things that they're likely to experience, additional challenges that we're going to face. Now, part of the reason that they're using companies like some of the really excellent companies that are on the presentation today is because you're the guide, right? You're going to help them get through this challenging process that really is any remodeling project. And I always tell people, if I was going to climb Mount Everest, right, which I wouldn't, but if I was going to, I'd want to do it with somebody that's already done it, that knows what to expect, to know what's going to come down the pike, right? That's the value of what we bring to the table. But now we're kind of climbing Mount Everest, and we're doing it in some pretty inclement weather and some outside challenges that maybe aren't always the case. And so it's really important to communicate that to the customer from the very beginning, because they need to know what to expect, but we also don't want them to lose faith along the way. They need to understand that some of these challenges are things that they're going to get them through, but they're not going to be without their difficulties. Again, focusing on controlling what we can, because there may be some more things that historically we've been able to control really well, whether it's schedules from our trade contractors or supply or any of those things. Becomes really important to be really, really good at the things that now are still within our control. And, that extra day that we save by not tripping something up that could go either way could be really important, because it might be offsetting a day that we have, additional delays or costs that we couldn't control. And the last thing really is, I think, in kind of thinking about this is, how do we continually evaluate where we are in the customer process, especially somewhere between that sales process and the production process, that pre-construction period of time? How do we continually evaluate where the customer is in relation to their budget? where we are in terms of availability of product, and how close are they getting to the edge where all of a sudden a customer that we never really historically would have been concerned about losing might be getting as far as they can and then just fall out of the sequence. And of course, the big challenge in that is how quickly can we put somebody else into the sequence with everything else that's going on. So it's a continual process of really looking at it and making sure that we understand that, that customer is getting very close to, the max amount that they seem, that they have budgeted, or that they can actually even have access to. Or there are certain things that we know, whether it's time frame or other things going on in their individual lives, that are making them more in jeopardy than maybe they would have been otherwise. So these are all things that go into this issue of throughput. And so as we face the second half of 2022, right, hopefully a lot of you by now have seen your June financials. You know what the first half of the year looked like. Hopefully for many of you, it was a great first half of the year. I know there were some folks that started off with a little bit of a slow first quarter, picked up some steam after that. Other folks are looking at the pipeline saying, leads are maybe slowing down a little bit. We're seeing some interesting things out there. But a big part of how well we perform in the second half of 2022 and how well set up we are for an early good start to 2023 is going to be this issue of throughput. What is in our system right now that needs to get through the system, because we've sold it. We're in the midst of designing it maybe. We're ordering the materials, we're lining things up, but how many months do we have left and how much are we going to actually be able to produce so that we're actually being able to record that profit? And what's that going to mean for what we carry into the next year? So I want to talk about 6 strategies. I like to tell stories because I think that they're easier to remember. So the first one I want to talk about is really making everything about launch dates, right? So one of the great fascinations I have is the space program. I think it's just lots and lots of great lessons you can learn from it. It was sort of, in my childhood years, that was one of the big things going on. And I just think it's one of those examples of systems and things coming together and big audacious goals and things like that, right? But when you look at the launch of a spacecraft, whether it was back during the Apollo program or what we have going on now, everything is driven by the launch date, right? From the earliest get-go, the earliest goals that we had about what we were going to be able to accomplish, it was, President Kennedy saying, we're going to do this by this time in this decade. And it set an artificial, in many respects, but it set a deadline, a launch date, and everything worked backwards from there. And even today, as individual missions are developed and the sequence of things that have to happen is created, so much of it is based on the launch date and things that work backwards from there. Now, in that, there's about a zillion variables, right? Everything from weather to budgets to, technological challenges, material delays, and all of that. And at the core of it, everything is being judged, engaged, and looked at by those launch dates. Well, right now, the companies that we see being very successful, from the time a customer becomes really a good prospect, even about to sign on to their project, companies are starting to assign, if we get this project, right, if it goes forward, we're thinking it's going to be first quarter of 2023. We're looking probably maybe February or March. We're starting to get an idea of what a potential start date would be. This is critically important for a number of reasons. One of which is some companies have a big backlog. And so how far out you're going to be may determine whether or not the customer even goes forward with the project, right? The second thing is everybody right now is also trying to gauge capacity, right? And so when we start to look at what's in the pipeline and what could close and how much we're going to be able to do and maintain the quality we have, maybe with limited staff, maybe with a finite set of subcontractors, whatever it might be, it's important for us to start thinking about where these things are going to slot into our process. More importantly, though, is we see that companies that have a really good chance of having a very profitable year, no matter what level you're operating at, it's when production flow, production capacity stays within a certain range. right? And so if you're going to be a $3 million company this year, right? That means on average, we're going to do about $250,000 worth of work per month. Well, we may have some months where we're significantly lower than that. But then we have to question, do we actually have the capacity, not from a sales standpoint, not from a billing standpoint, but from an actual production standpoint, can we flex way the other way? Do we have the capacity to do that? So it's super important not to go too low, because we may not be able to flex to a number that's significantly higher. Now, if we're behind on sales, we can make up sales in a very short period of time. But if we're behind on production, there's only so much we can flex up to be able to hit those numbers that we need to hit. So it is really, really important that in staying at a flow, right, that we don't go too low on any given month, which means we've got to let production capacity, and therefore the dates that we're going to slot these projects in, be the driver wherever we can. Historically in the industry, and of course I'm saying historically, I'm going back to 5 years that I've been involved with the industry, the process was we sold it, and after we sold it, it went into design. And when we finished designing it, we ordered the materials, and that determined the launch date, right? I'm telling you, the very successful companies right now are figuring out where this project's going to fit in terms of that launch date, and they're working their way backwards, because it's so important that we don't get to November and find that we just don't have enough to do, because it doesn't mean that we're going to be able to flex up a tremendous amount more than that necessarily, just because we have a bunch of projects hit at a later date. So as we're watching things go from our pipeline from being a prospect into design, and again, that sequence of design, and I'll talk a little bit more about this with our second strategy, is that we want to make sure that all of it is determined by how do we keep production busy? How do we feed the beast that is that production team working at the capacity that we need to be working at? And then, of course, making sure that our production flow and our production scheduling and all the good practices that we put into place keep pace with that, work well with that, and make that happen. And so it's really a kind of a shift to kind of work backwards from the launch date, no different than when NASA says, okay, here's a date, it's going to be spring of 2023. And because of that, these are the things that have to happen, the predecessor activities to that, right? And all the things that happened before us being able to go in and do demo and start the project need to work backwards from that date. And the challenge in that also is that because of the possibility of a project falling out of sequence, or a material availability changing, or some other circumstance changing, it might be that the project that was slated for that date now needs to move, and we have to adjust another project and work our way backwards. And so it's really, really critical to hone in on these dates and be talking about them all the time. Because what we've seen, and I've had a couple of instances this year, and they've been painful to watch, companies that have a lot of activity, but because production wasn't driving the ship, they got to a point where all of a sudden we had stuff stuck in design, and just a couple of months where we were grossly underproducing on the production side. And it's going to be really, really hard to make that up with the 6 months that we have left in the year. So we want those launch dates to drive what we're doing. The second thing is the word sorry, right? And it's actually the game sorry. This is not Michael sorry. I want to make a distinction between the various sorries, because I don't want to confuse things here, right? Not that we wouldn't like to talk about Michael, but this is different, right? So when I look at folks, and I spend a lot of time working with folks that are working on managing the pre-construction process, sequencing things for design. And maybe we have a designer or two or three. And when I talk to them, I like to say, well, how many projects are you handling right now? And how are you deciding what to work on, like today, this week? How are you allocating your time? And I get a wide variety of answers, right? Some is like, well, it really depends on who's yelling the loudest. Or maybe it's who I haven't done anything for in a certain period of time. For some, it's I've got to get this one done because we need it to go into production. For others, it's like I try to do a little bit on each project, every day or every week or whatever it might be. But at the end of the day, I would encourage you to think about it kind of like the board game Sorry. Now, Hopefully you all remember this. It was one of my favorite games as a kid. I think it sort of stands the test of time, right? But the idea with this game was you had 4 game pieces that you had to get out of the starting place, right? And you had to draw a certain number, a 1 or a 2, to get it onto the board. And if you only had one thing out and whatever number you picked, you kind of just kept moving it along. There wasn't a lot of decision making to be done, right? The interesting thing though was if you got multiple pieces out on the board, right? And then you drew a card, and I think it was a 7 that you could kind of split, like your choice between that number. You could use 7 in any combination. Then the question became, okay, well, how am I going to best move things along? Well, in most cases, it was somewhat random. There were some spots you didn't want to be in, but the closer you got to getting one of your pieces all the way into that last stretch, that safety zone, right? That was a really smart thing to do, because once it was in there, no one else could bump it off the board and send you back to the start. So when I look at folks trying to look at their design process right now and look at multiple projects going on, yeah, we've got to keep things moving forward. Yes, we can't let customers be ignored or fall too far behind. But it is also critically important, if we've gotten really clear on these launch dates, that we are also using kind of this sorry way of thinking to say, I've got to make sure that this project or these 2 are getting all the way there because they have start dates that I need to make sure they're ready for, right? Getting every project a little further may not be as important as getting a couple of projects all the way there so that start date isn't in jeopardy. And right now, when I have a lot of folks, and it's interesting because when I talk to folks in different companies, right, depending on the size of the company, if I ask them who's responsible for sales, someone always can give me, the name of the person. Usually there's a person or someone that's ultimately responsible. If I ask about production, a lot of times it's the same thing. It's a production manager, it's our project manager, it's one of the owners. When I ask who's responsible for pre-construction or that interim phase, a lot of times I get multiple answers, right? Well, we've got a designer and we've got an estimator, we've got someone doing ordering. And really what it says is this process that has become as important, I think, as sales and production doesn't in many cases have one person saying, this is how we're going to navigate the ship. And I hear sometimes people saying, well, I don't want to micromanage. Our team knows what they need to do. And I totally get that. But it needs to be that they're doing that with a full understanding of what does production need so these things keep flowing. Okay. So getting a couple of those projects to that point and knowing what the predecessor activities are things that we can start to map out and measure all the way through once we know roughly what that start date is. The other thing that's somewhat challenging for folks is we come out of a really, in many respects, a first in, first out way of thinking. We sold it, it's the next to go into design. When that design's done, it's going to go into production. But the fact is sometimes because of what we're experiencing with the product delays or because of just, what it's going to take to get something done, sometimes even because of delays from the customer, that project that came in first might be the third that's going to go into production. So the sequence has got to be driven by that launch date, not just first in, first out, which sometimes means we have to encourage our team, even when they're sometimes pretty far along on something, it might not be the top priority. Doesn't mean we want to abandon it. Doesn't mean we want to redo all the work or lose the ground that we've made. But again, first in, first out isn't necessarily meshing up with production the way we need it to. So that's what I want you to be thinking about in terms of sorry. The third thing is really about accountability, right? And so the example I like to give is, a lot of times when we see a field goal kicker, right, it's usually at a really critical point in the game. And the field goal kicker is out on the field pretty much on their own, other than the person that's, holding the ball for them. And at the end of the day, it's usually pretty consequential whether that ball goes through the upright or not. And if it does, right, kicker's a hero. That's great. And if it doesn't, a lot of times that kicker will go to the sideline. Coach will put their arm around him, give him some feedback. The team will kind of buck him up. But the reason why it becomes a coaching moment, why it becomes an opportunity to regroup and reevaluate and remotivate that person is because we all fundamentally agree whether or not the ball went through the upright, right? So picture an incredibly foggy day, and we've got a field goal kicker out on the field, and they go and they line up and they kick the ball and it headed toward the uprights, but we really just can't see that far. And we really don't know if the ball went through the upright or not. And that kicker comes to the sideline and feels pretty good about himself. He lined things up. He put his best effort into it. He knew what the objective was, working really hard. And the coach says, yeah, you suck. That didn't go through. That's not good, right? It is so incredibly important that when we're looking at what we need from our team, especially at these critical junctures, especially when we have these deadlines, that they have very, very clear expectations of what we need from them, that we have constant measures, and not to be like chasing people around with a clipboard, but to just know the difference if something was good or not good, right? For them to know, did we hit our goal or not hit our goal, and make sure they get well-timed feedback. A lot of times when people talk to me about holding the team accountable, getting the productivity that we need. And right now, this is a critical factor in controlling those things that are within our control, right? It's that situation where we had to wait 6 weeks for something to come in from our vendor. And then it sat for 2 weeks and we go out to install it and we open the box and we find out that it's broken or that it's not the right item. Well, that first 6 weeks was beyond our control, but that last 2 weeks wasn't. And the 4 weeks we have to wait now to get it is also something that's really on us. And so at the end of the day, a big part of getting the most out of those situations and avoiding things where we slow things down even more or have delays that could have been avoided is about really good accountability. Person that knows they're responsible for a task. The deadline is clear. The steps are clear. And if we're not where we need to be, to make sure that that well-timed feedback isn't about, how good or how bad a person is, or are they trying, or why can't they think like the owner? It's about the ball didn't go through the upright. We can all agree on that. Let's figure out what we need to do next time so that it does, right? But at the end of the day, the better our performance is and the better that accountability is tied to the tasks that we've identified as critical. For every day we lose because of something we don't control, there's an opportunity, right, to do something a little bit better than we expected or budgeted for and make some of that ground up. Because I know when you do estimates, nobody is estimating for the perfect job, right? When you say something's going to take 4 weeks, it could be 3.5, it could be 4.5. You're using a range that you can cover your costs. But because of that, that means that things could go better, right? And so there is an opportunity to pick up ground. So getting really dialed in to roles, training, and that feedback, that accountability is super important. But again, a lot of times when I go out and talk to folks and say, okay, well, what's a good week? How do you know when you really nailed it? What's something that's critical about this step you're working on? Sometimes those things are a little bit vague, and there's an opportunity there to dial that in just a little bit better. And so think about that when you're kind of working through those processes. The next one is going upstream. So everything that we do, right, culminates on that last day when we get that last check and the punch list is created. The punch list is completed and everything is done, right? We have that happy smiling customer and they go back into their home and they give you that great testimony. Everything else from that moment is upstream all the way to the point where that customer first comes in contact with your company. A lot of what we deal with on a day-to-day basis, a lot of when we have a production issue or something that has to be reworked or something that's slowing us down, a lot of times that situation could have been improved, or we may not have to deal with the lesser of two evils if something different or better happened upstream, right? So there's a really great book called Upstream by a gentleman by the name of Dan Heath. And the first page of that book gives a parable, and it's actually out of the healthcare industry. It's been around for a long, long time. There's different variations on the story. I'm going to quickly paraphrase it for you, right? There's these two guys, they're out at a park. There's kind of a stream running through the park. They're sitting there, and as they're having their lunch, there's a kid in the water that's waving their arms and screaming, and by all appearances is drowning and needs help. So these two guys jump up from where they're sitting, they jump into the water, grab that kid, pull him to the side, and just as they're getting to the shore, another kid comes down the water, comes down the stream, same situation. They jump back in the water, grab that kid, pull him to the side, and as soon as they do, two more kids emerge coming down the water. They jump in again a third time, grab the kids, and go to the side. And with that, another child appears. So one of them jumps back in the water, but the other one starts running up the hillside. And the one in the water says, "Hey, where are you going?" And he says, "I'm going upstream to figure out who's throwing these kids in the water," right? And so a lot of times what we do in our work is we're putting out fires. We're pulling the kids out of the water. We're dealing with the circumstances we have because we have no choice. Now, the actual story where it comes from is that when that person goes upstream, what they see is there's not somebody throwing these kids in the water. It's not something someone's purposely doing. There's actually a bridge that's had the guardrail broken, and these kids are coming along and they're jumping into the water. And so the fix is the bridge. The fix is the guardrail, right? So a lot of times when we're looking at what's going on, and we do this exercise with a lot of companies when we're working with their production team and things that are slowing them down and communication, because it's always easy to blame, well, that came out of design, and design can always blame sales, they didn't get the specs right or didn't give the customer the right expectation. But the reality is if there's something we can identify further upstream that we can do to make sure that the scope of work is clearer, the customer expectation is better, the opportunity for us to not be in the situation where we've got to decide between either not having what we need or leaving the job site to go to Home Depot, right? There's something earlier in the process that kept us from having to do that. What we're finding is even if it's just sharing the story, even if it's not the whole book, the companies that are having these conversations with their team, and I just did this with a company with 75 employees, and we did an entire day on just looking upstream. And it was amazing some of the stuff they came up with when it was less about, why are you making my day miserable by throwing kids in the water, and realizing that it was much more, we need to have better communication. And there are small things we can do to make the next step in the process go better. Really, really powerful stuff. So I would encourage you to, if you like business books, it's a really easy read, even if you just get sort of the basics and read the story. But it's a powerful concept because, like I said, from that last moment when we're all said and done and that customer's happy, you have that last check, the punch list is completed, all the way back to that first interaction, everything that happened upstream contributed to how successfully we got to the end, how happy the customer is, how much money you made on the project, and how ready we are to get that referral from them. So going upstream is a big deal. In that, I'm a big believer that we are so process driven in the remodeling world that, we have processes for everything. Sales process, design processes, sales to production handoff, ordering processes. The processes are a really, really big deal, right? And so we spend a lot of time talking to folks about process improvement. There's lots of different ways to go at it. I particularly like a concept called lean. It's born out of the Toyota production system. And it's all about looking at a process from end to end, or just a slice of a process. It could be something as simple as how you process change orders and finding out where's the waste, where are the things that we're doing wrong, that are taking too long, where we're waiting, we're having to do it more than once because we didn't get it right the first time, and how do we eliminate that waste, right? So an example I always like to give, and it's just a tiny piece of this whole discussion, is the notion of changing a tire, right? And whenever I do this training, I'll ask folks, how long does it take to change a tire? And sometimes folks will say, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Usually someone in the crowd will say however long it takes AAA to get there. I think that's a perfectly acceptable answer, right? But at the end of the day, let's say we agree on 20 minutes. And I say to them, okay, if we took the rest of the day today, right? And all we did was put together a group looking at how can we get more effective at changing the tire. Do you think we could get it down to 18 minutes? And so of course the group says, absolutely, we could. What kinds of things we would do? We would maybe take out the jack and make sure we have all the pieces. We know how it works. We know, that we don't have a bunch of clutter in the trunk, all these different things. And we might get it down to 18 minutes. And I say, okay, well, once we determine that we could get it to a better place, I ask, well, how long does it take these folks to change a tire, right? And someone yells, well, 12 seconds or 14 seconds or whatever it happens to be. And then they very indignantly, like I haven't thought this through, right, say to me, well, but there's reasons for that, right? The reasons are this laundry list of things. Well, it's what they do for a living, right? They have a very specific task. They have the right equipment. They practice. They put things in a particular place. They communicate before the car even comes in. And that laundry list of things that they're absolutely right are exactly true about what makes a pit crew able to do that in just a phenomenal amount of time are things that we should be applying to every single one of our processes. Whether you look at your sales process or you look at your sales to production handoff or how you order materials, do you have clearly defined roles? Are we sequencing things in the right way? Do we have the materials where we need them and when we need them, right? Do we have the right equipment? Are we using the right software? Have we done the right training? Do we have constant communication? Has the customer told someone something, but it hasn't been communicated to the person that needs to make that decision or needs to place that order? And do we prepare and practice? And one of the most important things, I think, is this concept of internal and external time. So for the pit crew, internal time is the moment that's that 12 or 14 seconds from when that car pulls into that block until it pulls out, right? Everything that they can do before that internal time determines how effectively they use that internal time, right? It's the training they do ahead of time. It's the ordering, it's stacking the tires in a particular place. In our world, we have two kinds of internal time. It's from the time that project starts until it finishes. And I would also argue it's from the time we are on the job site every single day, right? The things that we can do at 3:30 the day before to make sure that at 7:30 the next morning, we have the right crew and the right material in the right place, we use our time way more effectively than realizing that at 7:30 in the morning, right? Or when we want that elapsed time for pre-production to be as smooth as it possibly can be, all the things that we communicate to the customer, satisfy before we're in that design process, or satisfy in the design process before we're in construction, means that we make the most of our internal time. Your ability to deliver projects on time and to combat some of the challenges that we're working with right now is wholly dependent on how effectively you use your internal time. But our folks need to know the difference. They need to know the things that we're going to figure out when we're not under the gun so that we are absolutely on our game once that contract starts or once that day starts. So it's really important. So that's one of the things I really like to make sure we share with folks. And as you'll see from the examples I'm giving you, and more than happy to send you the slides, I mean, none of this is like, long, drawn out, boring business chapter and verse, right? This is stuff, these are stories you could share with anybody in your team. They're going to get it, they're going to understand it, and it's going to be meaningful. To me, that's much more important to get folks on the same page. Okay, the next one is what I'm calling the script. And for that, I'm talking about the role of the customer, right? From the very earliest point in the process, we want to be able to define two things for the customer: what they should be able to expect and what role they play in a successful project, right? One of the things I love to do or love to encourage clients to do when they're building their sales process, right, is to explain to a customer, whether they use the example of being a guide or whatever it is, there are lots of things that go into a project. Our goal, our responsibility as your remodeling company is to help you get successfully through a process that's not that easy to navigate. Now, There are characteristics of a good job and there are characteristics of a difficult job. I'd like to share with you some of the characteristics that make a job go really well, okay? But in that, the next things that go on that list are really the things that we need the customer to do well for this job to go well. Now, it's hard to say to a customer when they're writing you that big check, or they're just about making that decision to say, well, the very first thing I'm going to do is give you a laundry list of things you need to do so I can do what I need to do. But the reality is, and I learned this in 17 years of owning an accounting practice, I could only do with the material people gave me the quality of what they gave me, right? Garbage in, garbage out. So sometimes when we're slowed down, when we're dealing with difficulties, it's because either the customer's expectation was off or the customer doesn't really understand their role. Now, most of us tell the customer, hey, you're going to have to make selections. We're going to need them in a timely fashion. It's good if you can make them, in some sort of a time frame. But then as I hear how people describe what those time frames are or the direction they give a customer, sometimes we're kind of vague. Right? We know that they should know that, we're probably going to do 3 or 4 iterations of a design, but not 17. But if I've never done a project before, I may not know that. Or if you're saying, hey, I need a decision on this or that so we can get started, to me, that may sound like in a week or two, you may be looking for that in a day or two. Now, I may not be willing to do it in a day or two, but if you say to me, hey, Doug, is that something you can get to by this weekend or would it be early next week? You're setting parameters for me that if you don't set them, I'm just going to use my own best guess. I am amazed at how many of the discussions that we're having are very open-ended, even though to us, they don't seem like they are. And common sense dictates we can't order the stuff until you pick it, right? But for that customer, it may be less consequential for them to do it 2 days from now than it is for you. Because again, keep in mind, everything we're doing has got to tie back to that launch date. If the customer says to you, you know what, Doug, I'm going on vacation. It's going to be 2 more weeks before I can get that to you. That may not fundamentally change their life, but it may fundamentally change whether you can get that job sequence where you need it. So at the end of the day, we really want to be able to explain to them in the nicest way possible, what is your role? What is this? What is the piece of this we're asking you to play? I love to just describe it as, hey, these are the things that separate a great project from a not so great project. Let's talk about how that works for you, how you like to be communicated with, how you're going to, take on those responsibilities. At the end of the day, and we're coming up on our hour, and hopefully you can tell I get a little excited about this because I know that when we get these things just a little bit right or a little bit better, they can make such a big impact. Is I encourage you to make sure that you very proactively have your 3-step plan, that you're incorporating that into discussions with your team, that this issue of, yeah, we've got this burden and yeah, we've got these challenges. And of course we have all our processes, but let's take a step back and just talk about what like a better throughput process could mean. And it's not that you necessarily need to adopt all of these strategies. It may be 1 or 2, it may be some component of them, but in that, what are we doing with launch dates? How can we incorporate that? What can we do with that strategy of sequencing and prioritizing? What does that sorry board look like for us when you have that choice of how to spend the next day or how to spend that next week? What does it look like for each individual person's responsibility, right? Do they know what role they play? Do they know what's going to make a difference in terms of them having a really great performance today or not? And if we're not where we need to be, how do we take it away from, something that builds up or something that becomes incredibly negative to simply say, listen, on this particular thing, this is what it looked like for that ball to go through the upright. That's not what happened. So let's talk about what we need to do. Is it training? Is it clarity? Is it how we're describing things? But let's get it right, because my belief is most people want to be able to deliver for you. The whole notion of going upstream and how critically important that is, we can get good at putting out fires or we can get good at fire prevention. And sadly, for some of us, we're so good at putting out fires, sometimes we don't see a fire until it's a fire, right? There's no excitement in fire prevention. There's no, sirens and bells and hoses and all that, right? The absence of a fire looks pretty boring until you look at what it does to your gross profit margin. That's pretty exciting, right? The pit crew and just this notion of, hey, when we've got a process, does it meet that criteria? Do I know what my role is, your role is? How are we going to stage it? What's our internal time? What are the things that we need to do ahead of time? And how are we going to practice this and get really, really good at it? Because when that 7 o'clock bell goes off or that project starts, how can we, with each successive project, be better and better at our game? And ultimately, the script. How are we laying this out for the customer? The expectations, the understanding that, you know what, normally you'd see us every day once a project starts until it finishes. In today's world, it's quite possible you may not see us on a given day. It's not that we're not thinking about you. It's not that we're not working on your stuff, but just the sequencing of things is that's going to happen over the course of time. Don't freak out. It's got nothing to do with our ability to get this done when we're telling you we're going to get it done. Those kinds of things can make things go tremendously better. So that's kind of what I want to present. I'd love to have, and I've got time for questions and dialogue. I would be remiss. One thing we always like to do is anybody that would like to just talk about your throughput plan, and we have time, allotted for it. You can reach out. We call it 15 minutes with Doug. You can email me at doug@remodelersadvantage.com. Put the word throughput in the subject line. We'll schedule an appointment. If we need more than that, we can always schedule more. But just to say, hey, in my world, how would I do some of this? Or I have some questions or whatever. You can also go to www.15minuteswithdoug.com, and that'll put you right in my calendar. I will tell you that my wife consistently tells me, I don't know why anybody would want to talk to you for 15 minutes, but if there are people that would like that, more power to you. That's awesome. Last thing is, I would be totally remiss, especially because of the power of the relationship we have with Pro and you guys being in the area, to remind you that our summit this year is at National Harbor, September 20th through the 22nd. Theme is Elevate Your Business. And we are super excited about the fact that we have a substantial discount for Pro Mid-Atlantic members. So if you are inclined to want to register for it, Summit 2022 Pro is a code that will get you $600 off the standard price. So anyhow, that's my spiel, but we're really, really hoping that the power of this being in our backyard and in your backyard is that we get to do some really cool things together. So I'm going to take a deep breath now.
Great job. Thank you, Doug. And just to reiterate that, it is highly unusual that we get to have Summit in our backyard. It is going to be really exciting. I got to attend last year in Phoenix. So I encourage you, if you have never been, it is well worth the investment. And to save $600 just by being a Pro member is great, great savings. As a Pro member, you also get a substantial discount on Remodelers University. So for more information on that, you could reach out to me or Debbie. All right, Doug, I'm sending it back to you. Did you have time for questions?
I do.
Any questions for Doug? I see some faces from other areas. Hi, Gregory. How are you? I'm glad you guys could jump on. Any questions for Doug on throughput?
Doug, not necessarily a question, but kudos for putting all that into 1 hour of conversation. That took us 20 years to learn that and all that good stuff, and we continue to work on it. The nebulous area you talked about in the pre-construction zone, that's what continues to trip us up as well. We do about 20 million a year in design remodeling in the Philadelphia area. And because we're handing the baton off so many times, it's that gray area in between after the sale, and the salesperson was super excited and drove that whole process up to that point, and you haven't started production yet. So your project managers are knee deep into all the other stuff they got going on. The last thing they want to do is get involved in a project that's really not hot and burning right now. And so we have really spent a lot of time to try to pull the project managers forward and extend the salesperson's involvement later to make sure there's a really good overlap. And one thing that has worked for us is we do something called a spuddle. It's a sales to production huddle. And we use this term a lot. It's a 20 to 30 minute meeting. We use Smartsheet as a software. It's basically Excel on steroids and allows us to do a lot of checklists. And so all those things that have to be done in that time period, we want to make sure they're assigned for accountability, because there's 5 different people on that team: the estimator, the designer, the drafts person, the project manager, and the salesperson. And somebody has to be accountable. You can't have multiple people accountable to one item, because when multiple people are, nobody is. So we found that sputtle, which happens 72 hours after a sale. So after we ink it, we haven't cashed the check yet. We do that sputtle, and we basically go through this whole list of stuff and assign accountability and who that due date, right? When's the rocket going to launch, or when is the individual going to commit to that that timeline, so that we can start the project on September 12th, like we talked about.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Does anybody else do that or anything like that in pre-construction?
Daniel, I see you nodding.
Yeah, we do something similar. We have a checklist, and each person is assigned, a line on that checklist in our pre-con. And, we have a flow chart as well that we went through, and each person kind of made sure that every part of their process was listed on that flow chart. And then the flow chart is color coordinated per person, so that we know who's responsible for each. And we try to review that on a regular basis, just to make sure that everybody's understanding what they're responsible for.
Right.
But yes, pre-con is always that area where projects can just drag on. And it can be one person in that 5 people that are handling it, or it could be that whole team, just depending if they're not making sure they're checking off those to-dos that they have for each of those jobs. I think it's probably the biggest issue for everyone, because there isn't one person usually in charge of it.
Yeah, we are seeing that there are some companies that have actually created kind of a pre-construction manager position. So they do have someone in that role, which is kind of interesting. Others have really started to look at the combination of sales and design. That's kind of a unique animal. It's not always a good fit. But where, Greg, to your point, you got to really kind of stretch it, right? It's like, I think of Evel Knievel trying to get across that cavern, right? It's like, and that's gotten wider and it's gotten more critical.
You're dating yourself, Doug. First it was Sorry, and now it's Evel Knievel.
I know.
Half of these kids don't know who he is.
I know. Well, yeah, that's what Google's for. Right?
Kenny says I do.
That's right.
And
Yeah,
Stretch Armstrong, we need Stretch Armstrong.
Stretch.
Right. But it's a challenge, because that handoff alone really encompasses so much more. And it's where right now, I think before, not that it was ever easy, but a lot of the handoff issues were internal. They were things we had more control over. And now, because so much of those are actually being impacted by things that are outside, it's not just a matter of us communicating and us being organized. It's no, that's coming out of the blue because we can't get that item anymore, or in a timely way, or whatever it is. So it's definitely created a new set of challenges, but that is how some are navigating it too.
Yeah, we actually did take our estimator and kind of put him in that role, because he's a very detailed person.
Yeah.
And estimating alone doesn't fill up his week. So he's kind of in charge of making sure projects are moving through that pre-con phase. And he's really good at note taking. So every week he sends out an update for each project in pre-con, and basically outlining, here's what's outstanding, here's what's due this week, and here's what's, for the future, to kind of give the designers and the selections people the understanding of what they should be prioritizing that week.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That's a fantastic idea, Dan. We do that for the clients, right? For the outward facing, we do it every Friday. Designer sends it out in design. Project manager sends it out of production on the production side. But why don't we service ourselves internally and do the same thing, that weekly update, because we skim through it, read through, oh man, I gotta do this thing. It forces you to think about what you're doing next week on a Friday, and you can kind of pre-plan to it.
Yeah.
Good
Yeah,
suggestion.
he usually does it on Monday morning.
Even better.
So that way it's fresh in everybody's mind. Hey, this is what's outstanding. Let's get it done. Let's knock it out this week.
Awesome. Any other thoughts or questions? This is great.
I have a question, Doug. earlier in your presentation, you mentioned the word, when we get to the punch list. And I was wondering if people are still using that term. I've eliminated that from my vocabulary 15 years ago. When I finish a project, I turn it over to the client and say, let me present you your finished project. Let me show you its features. I don't want them in charge of the project. And I've always heard that if you ask your client to say, will you develop the punch list? We'll come back here Monday with our punch out team and we'll take care of all the little details. That's going to eat up your profits if that's your business plan, is my opinion. So I'm just curious if others in the industry, are we still using the punch list term? Do you have another process that will consume that and take that word out of our vocabulary? I don't use it anymore. I don't care for it. I've never had somebody to say, oh, well, don't forget this over here. Don't forget to touch that up. When I turn it over, I say it's done. Let me show you the features of the finished work.
Yeah.
They accept it as that.
It's a really good point. I will tell you internally, I think majority of folks that I interact with still use the term, but I totally agree with you. I know Tim Fowler spends a lot of time talking about the idea of just a zero punch list, not ending a project with a punch list. And we've had some folks talk about different company down in Florida that they do sort of even before the scheduled end of the project, they kind of do an impromptu walkthrough. So it's really more of a, not sort of let's come up with a list of every last thing that's, you can think of, but more of starting to really celebrate the things that are going, that are components of the project. But it's a great point. Other folks have thoughts on it because it's a term that basically says, you're going to sit here and come up with a list of things that you want us to do.
All right, good conversation. Anyone else have any other questions or comments for the group? I see a comment in the chat that accidentally came just to me, and it was David Benson from Architessa. I think, David, I'm sorry, I'm looking back to see what it was. He seconds the use of Smart Sheet.
Yeah.
All right. Anybody else?
Steve, I want to applaud your don't call it a punch list. I think that's old dogs and new tricks, but it's a good way to go. Being the artistic one, like, so Doug, as we're like listening, I'm like sketching the gorgeous, rocket taking off, and it's sexy and it's fire and it's amazing and it's incredible. What's the launch date of an 8-month remodel?
Well, I think you start with a range. I think you hone in, at some point as you get closer to it. But, usually they talk like NASA talks about a launch window, right? It's sort of a range of time, but then as you get closer, you can hone in on it. But I mean, the sooner you can identify even just a target date, lots of other things get triggered back from that. I think one of the things that we're seeing now is in some of these discussions and some of these processes, that's when we're hearing that's not realistic, or that, and those conversations are happening earlier.
Well, so let me ask the question better.
Sure.
I know when a rocket gets launched, there's a lot there's a lot of external time and not much internal time in a rocket launch. I know exactly when that is. I know when the tire change is.
Yeah.
But I think to take this concept and
I get you.
There's a lot of sales, there's a lot of design, there's a lot of pre-construction, there's a lot of build. In your mind, having helped companies like ours for the past 5 years, congrats on your anniversary.
Thanks.
What's the launch date?
So, okay, now I get the question now. I mean, to me, in the context we're talking about, it's that first day of demo. It's when you have folks on site.
Does everybody just agree with Doug?
I mean, there's lots of processes you're doing before that, but in terms of this sequencing all of those other processes, it's,
Demo day.
Yeah. To me.
I think if you're trying to fill your production schedule, I understand what Doug's saying in basically working backwards, right? You fill in your projects. If you
Mhm.
say, well, if I estimate whatever 6 months of design and pre-con, and then it's going to take another 6 to 10 months, whatever, to get materials. Here's my estimated start date. If this all works to plan, put that in some sort of calendar so that you're saying, okay, if we want to hit that point,
Right,
we have to order materials by X date.
right.
So you're kind of working backwards to then make sure your pre-con team is getting you to that order date, before that order date.
So Daniel, would you use demo day? Is that what would you use?
Yeah, I would use demo day, basically the day we start.
Mhm.
We
Steve?
usually do a project walk the first day and then do demo the next day. So, either or, just basically the start of construction.
Mhm.
And then you have billable hours on your project. When you're starting, you have activity, you have tradespeople doing their craft. It's billable time. That to me would be a launch date, in my opinion.
I do think you raise a great question, Michael. Whatever it is in your organization, it should be crystal clear to everybody,
Yeah,
right? Whatever we're calling it, whether it's that walkthrough day or it's the demo day or whatever, clarity right now is a big deal. Terminology and those is I think something that can really help an organization with all of these challenges.
I started doing something similar to this about a month ago. I created another calendar in my Outlook calendar that is basically estimated production dates, right? So I just kind of put in there question marks in front of the job name, and I try to estimate when I think we can start that job if we get through pre-con in the time frame that I'm thinking it'll take. And we're doing it partly because of the long lead times on things, right? So we're estimating our cabinets and appliances, things like that, and then trying to fill that production calendar and understand, okay, these are the projects that we have lined up. These are the crews that we're assuming are going to be on those jobs, so that we're not double booking projects or subs, and just kind of thinking backwards that way to figure out the timeline of when can we get these jobs produced.
Mhm. Greg, do you guys have a launch day?
I think you nailed it, Michael. You asked a good question. What is that moment? Because it's not a moment, it's a time. But Steve really articulated well. The launch day is demo. And the reason it's important is because that's when we generate GP.
Yeah,
Like all the other activities that lead up to that, the design facilitates construction. As awesome as designers as we are, right? It's going to look great when we're done. But we're here because we need to earn a GP per day, per week, per month. And you don't start earning that until you start the demo.
yeah.
So that turns the faucet on, if you will. And then it's our job to keep the faucet running until the end and as short a time period as we can.
Yeah.
Faucet or floodgate?
All been drinking from a fire hose for the last 2 years.
Exactly.
I have a quick question. Is it possible to realistically put in a start date in a contract anymore?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think
Which
about
attorney are you asking?
that?
Where's Thomas Cressman, our local attorney?
I just had my attorney redo our contract because of that, and it has a bunch of stipulations basically that the start date is upon final measure, material availability, like all these different things, because there's just no way to give an exact date anymore.
Global pandemic.
Yeah.
I put in
How about a completion date? How's that worked out?
Well, so my company does work in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, and the requirement of contractual law in our area is that you must put a start date and an end date in the contract. So you're exactly right. It's got to be contingent on the following things and agreed upon mutually by both parties.
So you don't need a date, you need a range of days. So you don't have to put a specific date. Because I'm in Maryland, DC, Virginia as well. And my attorney just redid it. You need to put that you're going to start within 30 to 60 days of
receipt of this or
right
receipt of that.
and then completed within 120 days or whatever, of start. So you
When the
don't have to put an
refrigerator
exact,
gets there.
yeah.
And then my suggestion is you put a comma after all those clauses that would say weather permitting.
Mm,
Okay, and in the DMV tomorrow, we've got a prediction of alleged 105-degree feel like temperature. Some of us aren't going to work outside after noon tomorrow because of that. Others thrive on it and they'll drink lots of water and work. I always put all my proposals, several locations say comma, weather permitting.
Yeah.
That means snowfall, heat wave, rain, thunderstorm, earthquake, weather permitting. I'm covered.
Steve, NASA does the same thing.
Weather permit. Yeah, launch date for the next rocket, comma,
That's
weather
exactly
permit.
right, weather permitting. Yeah.
Right.
All right, guys. Well, I hope this was helpful. It's informative. It's a great group, folks. And Angela, thanks so much for you guys putting this together. So it's always fun.
Thanks, Doug. You are always, you and the Remodelers Advantage team are awesome. I have a kid vacuuming upstairs. She likes to do that when I'm on meetings. Hey, at least she's vacuuming.
That's
All right.
good. Yeah.
Everyone, have a wonderful afternoon. It's going to be a hot one. Maybe find an indoor location for your happy hour.
Mike from Mid-South, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yes.
You're quite
Oh,
welcome, everybody.
Let's,
Glad it
yeah,
worked
let's
out.
close up with that too. Mike, we're going to get out the Matterport tour of your showroom, your product list, and we're also, Doug, can we share this recording?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so look for that. If you need anything, that will also have Doug's contact for you as well. So everyone have a great afternoon. If you want to stay and chat, I'd love to chat with you.
Take care.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.